something like this, with 6 hard sets for your chest on Monday and 6 hard sets for your chest on Thursday, totaling 12 hard sets for the week. Okay, next we need to cover intensity, which, despite its popular conflation with effort, technically refers to how heavy the weight is. You can either lift heavy weights for low reps or light weights for high reps. But what's the best for muscle growth? Well, it turns out that as long as you're taking sets sufficiently close to failure, you can maximize hypertrophy using high reps or low reps, or a combination of both. Research has shown that reps as low as 3 and reps as high as 30 all cause similar muscle growth. However, there does seem to be a limit to how light you can go. New data shows that when you lift weights lighter than 20% of your 1-rep max, you do see significantly less growth. But the average rep count subjects got with that load was 67 reps. Not a very practical way to train regardless. So the traditional 6 to 12 rep zone is kind of a myth in the sense that research shows you can go well outside that range and still grow fine as long as you're training close to muscular failure. Still, I think there is some value in that 6 to 12 range because once you start dipping down below 6 reps, you can risk unnecessary strain on your joints, and it can be practically more difficult to accumulate enough volume. And the more often you go above 12 reps, the more you risk just burning yourself out, as higher rep sets are harder to recover from. So for practical purposes, I suggest splitting it up like this, with the majority of your sets coming in that 6 to 12, or maybe 15 zone, while having smaller chunks dedicated to lower reps for continued strength progression and higher reps for stimulative variety. Now, I think exercise selection and execution is just as much an art as it is a science. Sure, I do tend to favor multi-joint compound movements like squats, presses, and rows in my own training because they give you more hypertrophic bang for your buck by activating large amounts of muscle mass while promoting more efficient total body strength gain. And while I definitely think mastering these basic compound movements is important, single joint isolation exercises certainly have their place, especially when it comes to targeting smaller muscles like the biceps, rear delts, side delts, and abs, which can be overpowered if you focus on compound lifts exclusively. Luckily, when it comes to muscle growth, there are no mandatory exercises. And so after mastering the basics, it's once again important to experiment with different movements and movement variations to figure out what works best for you and your body's mechanics. Now, when it comes to frequency, it seems like most people have flipped from thinking that you should only train each body part once a week on a split that looks something like this, otherwise you're going to overtrain and melt your muscle away, to these days, most people thinking that if you train on a bro split like this, you're never going to make any gains at all, because science? In reality, the latest research actually shows that frequency in and of itself likely plays a relatively minor role in muscle growth, and the latest studies show similar results between hitting a body part once a week and 3+ times per week. However, I still generally recommend hitting a muscle at least twice a week, and I do prefer splits like upper, lower, and full body over the traditional body part split because they typically allow for more volume per week and higher quality volumes per workout. Still, as long as you've got all the other variables in place, are recovering properly, and being consistent over time, this is an area of programming that probably deserves less of the spotlight than it tends to get. And then there are other training variables like rest periods, lifting tempo, and advanced intensity techniques that make up a relatively smaller piece of the puzzle, and rather than go into detail on these, I'll just link a few videos on them down below. Okay, so with progressive overload and the main acute training variables in mind, at this point I'd like to get a bit more granular and take a closer look at what's actually driving muscle growth physiologically. So in 2010, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld published a landmark paper with over 500 citations that introduced the 3-factor model of muscle hypertrophy. This model proposed that there are 3 main things driving muscle growth: mechanical tension, muscle damage, and metabolic stress. Now, the very short version is that mechanical tension is the type of force that tries to stretch a muscle fiber. One way to visualize this is like a tug of war. As each side pulls, tension is generated in the rope. So you can think of it like not only are the people pulling on the rope, but the rope is also pulling back on the people. It's similar in the muscle, where tension is passively created when the muscle is stretched, and tension is actively created during contraction when actin molecules are pulled by myosin heads. And as of now, tension remains absolutely undisputed as the primary driver of hypertrophy within the scientific community at large. Next, muscle damage is basically exactly what it sounds like: physical damage to the muscle like microtears and other cellular disruptions. And you can observe this under a microscope, where you see that the normal pattern in muscle can be seriously disrupted after training. Now, some believe that this type of damage is at least partly responsible for the delayed onset muscle soreness that you can feel in the days following training, although the soreness phenomenon is no doubt caused by a number of factors and still isn't fully understood. Still, for years, many people have just assumed that getting sore should be the goal of training, since soreness comes from muscle damage, and muscle damage causes muscle growth. But the latest science shows that that first claim is questionable, and the second claim is most likely not true. Of course, the most common sense way to think about this is that running a marathon would cause tons of muscle damage, but wouldn't do anything good for muscle growth. In fact, a review paper from Wackeridge and colleagues pointed out that, if anything, damage in this context would seem to decrease muscle growth. And even in a weight training context, damage doesn't seem to be doing much good. The study from Damas and colleagues argued that damage doesn't even correlate with hypertrophy over the long run. As shown in the figure here, early on in a training program, you see a huge amount of damage. This could be why you get so sore when starting a new routine. And while there is an associated early spike in muscle protein synthesis, the vast majority of that synthesis is directed toward repairing damaged muscle tissue rather than building new muscle tissue from scratch. And it's only after that damage decreases that muscle protein synthesis is directed toward new muscle hypertrophy. And while folks playing devil's advocate could argue, well, studies show that eccentric training causes more muscle damage, and studies also show that eccentric training causes more muscle growth, I would simply respond that correlation doesn't imply causation, and it seems more likely to me that the extra growth that you see from eccentric overloading could simply be coming from the fact that you can simply overload the muscle more heavily during an eccentric contraction, causing more tension in the muscle. Now, I should say that if we're being really honest, we don't actually understand muscle damage all that well. Even the methods of simply measuring muscle damage have been contested by prominent researchers. So the bottom line is that any theory that uses muscle damage to explain muscle growth is speculative at best and unfeasible at worst. But what about metabolic stress? Well, metabolic stress refers to the accumulation of metabolites like lactate and hydrogen ions and the muscle hypoxia that often follows weight training. And it's often associated with the massive skin-tearing pumps that you get from high-rep workouts. So if muscle damage and its ensuing soreness is unlikely to be driving muscle growth, surely the pump and its associated metabolic stress must be doing something. I mean, even Arnold seemed to recognize this.
The greatest feeling you can get in a gym, or the most satisfying feeling you can get in the gym, is the pump. Your muscles get a really tight feeling, like your skin is going to explode any minute. You know, it's really tight. It's like somebody blowing air into your muscle. It just blows up, and it feels different. It feels fantastic.
And while the pump does feel good and certainly can make training more enjoyable, and perhaps even provide some feedback that you're actually hitting the muscle that you're trying to target, it most likely isn't driving hypertrophy, because there are just too many examples of where the relationship between metabolic stress and muscle growth breaks down. Shorter rest periods cause more metabolic stress, but significantly less muscle growth than longer rest periods. Note that there's a footnote in the description box about this. Partial range of motion causes more metabolic stress, but often less muscle growth than full range of motion. Training all the way to failure causes more metabolic stress, but at best results in equal muscle growth to stopping a few reps shy of failure. And blood flow restriction training causes tons of metabolic stress, but doesn't enhance hypertrophy on its own, and doesn't even work in conjunction with training unless the training methods are highly suboptimal. And even in this case, it still seems to point back to tension. When I spoke with one of the authors of this popular blood flow restriction study, he pointed out that any benefit seems to be tension related.
Would you argue that the impact of BFR essentially leads back to just creating more tension in the muscle? Like, do you think it still goes back to tension?
Yeah, it's just BFR it's like cheating 20 reps extra in a sense. Right. It's the same effect, it just happens earlier.
So consensus is converging on tension, and perhaps tension alone, as being the primary driver of muscle growth. And so it should be the primary goal of our training to maximize tension above anything else. So how do we do that? Well, the practical application is actually quite simple. We need to apply progressive tension increases to the muscle itself. This means we need to lift with good, consistent technique while using the acute training variables and progressive overload to push the level of intramuscular tension up over time. Also paying attention to things like the mind-muscle connection, at least on certain exercises, and eccentric control should also help, as those aspects of lifting have been shown to increase intramuscular tension. Okay, so we know that mechanical tension is the main thing driving muscle growth, but what happens next? How do we get from a mechanical stimulus like tension to a biochemical signal that commands the muscle to grow? Well, Dr. Tromelin explained this to me in terms of blocks of dominoes. He said that when one thing gets activated, it passes on the signal to the next thing, and the next thing, and so on. But if you're smart, you don't just build one chain of dominoes. You build out all these side chains so that they fall in a bunch of different directions. And it's the same thing with muscle growth. There isn't just one pathway with one outcome, but rather many different interconnected pathways with many different downstream effects. So with that in mind, let's start at the top. All right, so we lift a weight heavy enough that it creates active mechanical tension within the muscle. This is called the stimulus. The stimulus is sensed by mechanosensors, which sort of feel that the muscle is being pulled into tension and pass that signal on. Now, based on the latest research, it isn't perfectly clear exactly which molecules are doing this sensing, but the top candidates include costomeres, which are collections of proteins that sit in the muscle fiber membrane and are responsible for holding muscle fibers together and transferring force between muscle fibers during contraction. There's also titin, which, as a fun fact, is actually the largest protein we've ever discovered in humans, and because it runs parallel to the muscle fiber itself, could theoretically be responsible for sensing mechanical changes like stretching, but probably only at long muscle lengths. And then there's filamins, which bind to the famous actin proteins that slide during contraction, making them a really good candidate for sensing tension. And for the record, I read through the latest paper on all this sensing stuff from 2018, and I'll just say, this area of research is not well understood yet. To quote the authors directly, conclusively identifying major hypertrophy stimuli and their sensors is one of the big remaining questions in exercise physiology. Still, we can paint the rest of the picture with a broad brush for now.